Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner.
Welcome to the Wesley Theatre, and tonight we are continuing in a series that has looked at the question of this person of Jesus. Just who is this man? We've looked at it in many different ways. We began Lent by the traditional way, looking at the temptations of Jesus, but then we started looking at some of those encounters that we find in John's Gospel of Jesus with people. We began in chapter 3 by looking at Jesus meeting the man Nicodemus, and that meeting took place at night as a religious leader, somebody of significance, came to him, and we watched what that encounter told us about Jesus as much as ever what it told us about Nicodemus. Then we saw Jesus encountering in the next chapter, chapter 4, a woman at the well. A woman who Jesus would not normally have spent time with. And yet somehow we discover as much about him as we do about the woman because of the way he treated her, because of the way he understood her and her situation. And then we talked about the fact that Jesus brought healing and life to a man who was born blind. And that man was given sight. But it wasn't just about the man who was born. It was all the chuntering and all the religious leaders that were telling us so much more about how they understood who Jesus was or who Jesus was not. Well, tonight we turn to chapter 11. The encounter of Jesus with Lazarus. Now, the home of Lazarus and Martha and Mary was very likely a familiar and favorite stopping off place, a place that Jesus visited, a place where perhaps Jesus could kick his sandals off and be himself. And that really tells us something about their relationship. So when we encounter Jesus facing the fact and the news and hearing it that Lazarus was ill and sick, it was a close friend who was sick. And that in itself is so very important. Not long ago, I listened to a presentation called The 4 Primary Colours of Emotion. And in that presentation, it was suggested that all emotions flow out of just 4. 4 emotions that define almost everything and every human experience. And the 4 were namely anger, sorrow, fear, and joy. Of course, there are many others that you might mix, just as you do primary colours to find secondary colours on the palette of life. But those emotions define so many of the things that happen within our lives. And I want to talk about one of them. And turning to John 11, I conclude that although it's about the raising of Lazarus, a deliverance from death to life, it's as much about what is happening around. What is happening to people who were paid to be perhaps mourners or friends there. What is happening in Martha's life and Mary's life as they observe. Perhaps even the disciples who were caught up in all that was happening. It's a lengthy and penetrating passage, like so many in John's Gospel. Whenever we have one of those great I am statements, we have this great narrative around it that help us to understand. And the great I am statement in Lazarus, of course, is, I am the resurrection and the life, says the Lord. What a wonderful I am statement, but in the context of Lazarus. You see, Jesus is not only the preacher of the Galilee, not only the healer of the sick, not only is he the leader of a band of disciples, he is the Lord. This man is also Lord, the one who can and does and will transform lives, not only then but now, if we're only prepared to allow him into our lives. There are many different kinds of fear. And in the context of the Lazarus story, there's a great deal of fear. Primarily, that fear may be about death. And I think we need to name it and address it and say that there are times in which we have to face the reality of death. Now, we're not talking morbidly, we're talking realistically. And I believe we shouldn't push it behind a curtain. We should face that reality for all that it is. I remember being a boy and thinking I wouldn't die. I'll outlive them all. I'll somehow keep fit and well and every day, and then it won't happen to me. That perhaps is a part of a fantasy that we live through, but we come out of, because the realization is driven home for all of us. There are many kinds of fear. I took time in preparing this address to look at the different kinds of fear that there are. Odontophobia, the fear of teeth. That's something, isn't it? Just think of that. Dextrophobia, the fear of objects on the right-hand side of the body. Levophobia, the fear of things on the left-hand side of the body. And here's another one. Peladophia, the fear of baldness and bald people. You know, we smile at them, but they're very serious. And you know, there are many, many serious things that people have that they're fearful of. There's a great deal of fear around in this chapter. The news of Lazarus' illness, the disciples struggling to come to terms with the decision to travel to Judea after this time of delay. It's a time of retreat, actually, you find in the end of chapter 10. It's a time of retreat. They had a break from all that was happening. They just recently, we're told in the chapter, narrowly escaped a stoning, so they needed a retreat. And Jesus uses the analogy of Lazarus falling asleep, when in point of fact he meant death. Thomas so demonstrated the seriousness of the moment that he's prepared to go and die and give himself because he knew what might be there. Bruce writes this: the signal for Jesus to leave his retreat in Transjordan and the return to the main scene of action in Judea was not long in coming, and that signal was the death of Lazarus. Mind you, I can understand two close friends saying, why did you stay for 2 days? Why didn't you come immediately? The answer is somehow bound up in the chapter and the responses of Jesus, who says he wants to show them something of his grace and power. And this is the first time the family are mentioned in John. And as Jesus and the disciples approach Mary and Martha's home, the tension in the passage is palpable. You can feel it. You could cut it. It's that real. And 4 days since the death of Lazarus, we're told that friends were always there. People were weeping, were there. Don't get on the bad side of all the weepers. I've heard so many sermons about the weepers. The weepers had a very, very important part to play very often in enabling people to cry. And I'll come to that in a few moments. Very important. Today, you see, you can call in the funeral director, the undertaker, and they say, don't worry about a thing, we'll do the lot. We'll do the flowers, we'll do the service, we'll do everything. You don't have to worry about anything. But I want to do something. I need to cry. I need to grieve. And we've now created a society that's at the other end of this. In the Middle East, not only in the Christian tradition, but other traditions also, weeping was important. And you remember it happened too at the house of Jairus when the daughter was ill, and Jesus went after being called from that journey where he had healed the woman who'd been sick for all those years and arrived there, and they were weeping. He sent them out of the house then. But the reality is that weeping was important. People that help you to cry. And do you know that in the earliest days, the little dolls that cried for children were meant to have a serious side to them, to show them that crying is okay. But we now live in a world where we say, oh, we mustn't cry. The last thing we should do is actually show the pain and hurt that we feel at that moment. 4 days. Now, people have tried to understand what that actually means. 4 days since the death of Lazarus. Some have talked about rabbinic evidence, and I think that it may well be that it's true that rabbis taught that on the 4th day the spirit left the body. That might be true. What's also true is there were 3 official days of mourning. So on the 4th, we're ready to move on to a new situation. When Jesus arrived at the village and then the tomb, Martha and Mary express grief. And they're upset because Jesus has not come quick enough. Both of them express it. If only you'd been here now, my brother wouldn't have died. If only both of them separately say the same kind of thing. So don't get down on one and say she's always in the kitchen and all that story built on one passage in Mark's gospel. Both of them are upset at what's happened. And they're upset because Jesus wasn't there. When Jesus saw Mary weeping, we're told he was deeply moved and troubled. And I think all of us know that experience. If somebody that we love really hits the wall of life with all its pain and sorrow, there is nothing harder than watching a friend in pain. It's one thing to do that with somebody who you do not know closely, but to see somebody that you love actually in pain and sorrow and hurt troubles you. Jesus asked where Lazarus was laid. This is one of those chapters where we have a sign and a narrative together. But here's the verse that I want to just hold before you. This is one of those great long narratives in John with the shortest verse in the Bible. When Jesus came and saw and found Lazarus, we're told, Jesus wept. Jesus wept. And that's, to me, one of these insights into what kind of man is this? Who is this? Who is this person? Is this person the many things that all through our Easter mission we shall think about? Is he, or is he really Lord? Fred Craddock comments on this particular chapter that the reaction of Jesus in any of the other Gospels would have made sense, but not necessarily in John. He just didn't expect it. Of course, in John, we have the humanity of Jesus because we're told that Jesus knew what it was to be thirsty. But for him to weep seems so very, very different, out of kilter with much of what we read in John's gospel, certainly about his glory. And the theme of tears is at once emotional. But we read actually in verse 36 after that text, then the Jews said, see how he loved him. So the tears are already moving us into a new understanding. The Jews that watched it were surprised. They were shocked. There are many different contexts for tears. There can be the tears of loss. There can be the tears of rejection. There can be the tears of unresolved pain. And there can be the tears of inability to do what we once did so easily in our lives. They're just a four of a list that could be far, far longer. And the heart of Jesus goes out to his friends in their loss. Let me say a number of things about these tears. About tears in general. There can be a wasting of tears. Not all tears are good. Although it's hard to say, it's important to recognize that not all tears are creative. The context of mourning here, such as we find outside the home of Jairus and also within the Gospels, was one of helping people to mourn, somewhat ceremonially, you might say. But the grief of losing someone must never be minimized. I don't think we want to come out with all those platitudes that so easily roll off the tongue when we try to help somebody. To talk about with somebody who's lost someone, say, no, it'll be fine. They don't want to know it'll be fine because it may not be fine. I've just lost Bill and spent 35 years with me. Don't sit down in 5 minutes and tell me it's going to be fine. And certainly don't tell me next week I'm going to feel better, because none of that. Or that wonderful one, time will heal. Let me say, if time will heal, that's not the time to say it. And in the reality of tears, there can be something very powerful and important. But sometimes tears can be very selfish. We see it in other contexts where people express their tears and they want people to see their tears. They want to draw people in sympathy with their tears. Not all tears are necessarily good. Some can be wasted. When I first preached on John 11, verse 1, I recall saying that there's something about weeping that is soft. And I got it wrong. I confess that over the years, I've tried to explore what it means. Do you know what it really means? When Jesus came and found his friend, in the original language, it means he burst into tears. And that's not really what we usually associate in our own culture, in our own language, with weeping. Weeping tends to be softer. But the actual original meaning is he burst into tears at the loss of his friend. And there are 3 occasions in the Gospels where Jesus wept, you know. Well, we're told Jesus wept. He wept over the city of Jerusalem, unbelieving city. He wept here by the tomb of a friend. And of course, he wept drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. But he didn't weep on the cross. That was not the place for weeping. And what's interesting is none of that weeping is for himself. None of it. It is always for others. Not only a friend, but an unbelieving people, and weeping over what was about to happen on the cross, not simply for himself as we might weep, but for all that that meant for a people. In another biblical context, when Jesus met the widow of Nain, whose son had died and who Jesus raised to life, we're told, when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. And he said, don't cry. It's interesting. For all that I've said of words that one might say, Jesus goes out in his heart to one in pain. Interesting, really, people say about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And some might say, this passage belongs to resurrection. Well, it would if we made the mistake of thinking the whole passage is simply about Lazarus being raised from the dead. But you see, actually, it's not just about Lazarus being raised from the dead. It's about the journey that Jesus is on to the cross. It's about the understandings, the misunderstandings of the disciples, the crowd, the religious leaders. And it is profoundly about that sense of sorrow and pain and fear being met by love. Undoubtedly, there is a time for tears. Shakespeare was right when he said, to weep is to make less the depth of grief. But to weep and weep and weep and never ever find healing is to miss much of what Jesus had to teach us. That's why some tears can be wasted if those tears don't eventually move into something more creative and healing. How easy it is to allow ourselves to grieve and grieve and grieve, not just about death, but so many things that happened to us in our lives. We have to move on. And moving on is so very, very important in our Christian discipleship. But secondly, tears can speak of love. Love, of course, is so very different from fear. It is the greatest antidote, if you like, to our understanding of fear, the presence of love. Tears can express love. And I think that's what we see in Jesus with his friend. He's expressing his love. The Jews said, see how much he loved him when they saw those tears. And as Jesus weeps, one way of understanding what is happening here is to see that it was a missed opportunity for the people. It'd be wrong to assume that Jesus is weeping because merely that Lazarus is dead and this is final. Could it be that Jesus is weeping at the tomb because they failed to see the truth of who he is? They failed to believe that a 2-day delay isn't going to make any difference to what Jesus can do for his friend who has died. And the critical point in the passage is the word to Martha. You see, she expresses her confidence when she says, we know at the end that we'll see him again, that he'll be raised to life. That was the Pharisaic position. It was different than the Sadducees. It was a very definite belief in resurrection. But Jesus is really saying, I'm not really too bothered about what your views are of what happens at the end. I am the resurrection and the life now. Martha, understand that the dividing point, the cutting point, the fulcrum, the moment in which everything comes to a point is now, here and now. For I am resurrection, I am life. Repeating what we read in chapter 5, also in John's Gospel about his risen statement. The full text is, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Then he asked the question, do you believe this? You see, if you stay with that view of resurrection that is a Lazarus view, widow of Nain's son, Jairus' daughter, and Lazarus were all brought from death to life by Jesus, but they all died again. There's no stories about any of those people living longer than anybody else. But when Jesus came out of that tomb, he came out never to go back. And what he offers is a resurrection life that is not dependent upon tombs and death, but takes us for an understanding that what we can experience now is resurrection life. And that begins to address this question of fear and all the things we throw around fear. I wonder what we'd have said if we'd seen Jesus crying. What would we have said? Would be embarrassed perhaps for Jesus? A man crying? After all, men don't cry. Absolute nonsense, if ever it was said. Would we be relieved? We'd say it's fine to cry. Some might even encourage it. We might say it's a good thing. Get it out of you. That's what I say. We might have been on that part of that scale. Or we might have been awkward and not really known how to handle it. And we'd rather just move on from this experience. It's amazing how many times people find themselves in the most profound and deep personal experiences and move on. We're inwardly fashioned for faith. Fear is not the natural place for the Christian. It is part of the experience of life, but we're fashioned for faith, not fear. And I see that wonderful way in which Jesus allows us to see and to knock on the door of the thing that people are perhaps most fearful of, death itself. E. Stanley Jones once said this: I can live better by faith and confidence than by fear, doubt, and anxiety. In anxiety and worry, my being is grasping for breath. These are not my native air. But in faith and confidence, I breathe freely. You know, a university doctor once said, we do not know why it is that worriers die sooner than non-worriers. But we know it's true. But in simple understanding, we can say that God didn't mean for us to live that way. I confess, like many of you, there are those things that cause anxiety in life. But somehow we have to grasp that faith and that life that Jesus came to us that overcomes fear forever. Takes it away, buries it in the deepest sea, removes it from our lives, and grants us a whole new vista on how to live our lives. And then, thirdly, fear will one day end. When we read that Jesus wept, we reach the final part of the wonderful chapter, which shows Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. F.F. Bruce is once again helpful when he writes that the death of Lazarus, with its impending sequel to resurrection, is the paradigm of the granting of eternal life to all believers in Jesus Christ. So it is not, in the commonest use of the word, an example where we can trust and say that's what's going to happen to us all at the end of time. No, it's not going to be exactly like that, 4 days in a tomb and bound, but it's a paradigm. It becomes, if you like, that picture that enables us to see a deeper truth of what God is always doing, because God is always raising people to life. Now, I know you're going to be careful as a preacher saying that. I'm not saying that tomorrow I will walk along the street and somebody who dies will be raised to life. But I know that whatever death means in its fullest sense, Jesus is in the business of new life and bringing new life into people's experience. And fear will one day end. Fear cannot ultimately consume us if we trust in Jesus Christ. The essential truth as we move through Lent and on to Easter is that we should have no fear because of what Jesus Christ has done for us. In Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan tells the story of Christian and hopeful coming to the river of death. And when they arrive at the river of death, they see how wide it is. They can only begin to think how deep it is. And they see how fast the water is as it moves swiftly along. And then as they stand there, two men come and stand beside them. And the two men stand beside them, and Christian and hopeful inquire, is there a bridge? Is there a boat whereby we can traverse the water? Of course there is not. So they then ask the question, how deep is the water? And the answer in Bunyan's profound words are this: you shall find it deeper or shallower as you believe in the King. Now, of course, I know it's written hundreds of years ago, but it's still the way that fear and how we handle it is related to our confidence and our vision of the man who is also Lord and our confidence in him. The great musical composer Ludwig van Beethoven lived much of his life in fear that he was going to become deaf one day. It affected almost everything he did because he knew this deafness was developing. And then one day, he suddenly realized that the progression of the illness that was his deafness had become worse. He went to see doctors about the anxiety he was feeling, the fear that was so bound up with being deaf. And as a great musician, you can only begin to imagine what that fear would amount to. But the great thing is this: that when he became totally deaf, he wrote some of his finest music. Somehow God enables us, as we're able to handle fear within our lives, to gain the victory of faith. When John was writing his first epistle, he affirmed the nature of God's love with perhaps the best verse on this theme that you'll find anywhere in the Bible. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out all fear, for fear is to do with punishment. See, the love of God is able somehow, men, women, and young people tonight, whatever the fear is in your life, cast it aside through his grace, because you can be released from it and granted a new vision and a new freedom and a new liberty. And when Jesus came and wept for his friend, I'm certain that some of the people watching, Mary, Martha, fellow disciples, or others, would begin to examine that this man was just no ordinary man, that he truly was and is the Lord. Amen.